This is Working for Progress, a podcast that connects us through conversations about how we craft our working lives and make progress. We'll be joined by our communities from Tribe Porty and Keystone. Tribe Porty is a community co-working space and creative hub. We are full of entrepreneurs, social enterprises, freelancers, charities, and SMEs. Keystone is the other social enterprise which supports women to reimagine their working lives. We do this by providing a holistic approach to business through courses, programs, mentoring, group coaching, and events.
Welcome to today's conversation. I'm Alice, the community manager at Tribe Porty.
And I'm Dani, founder and director of both Tribe Porty and Keystone.
Here at Working for Progress, we're all about connecting good people, sharing their stories, their challenges, and the progress they make for themselves and for others. We hope this podcast challenges your ways of thinking and inspires you to work for progress.
Working for Progress starts with simple pleasures, finishes in awe, and meanders through career journeys in between. Welcome to Working for Progress. Today we welcome author and award-winning social entrepreneur Briana Pegado. Briana's work has a focus in anti-racism, governance, and strategy consultancy, specifically in creative industries. A central theme in her work is how disrupting systems, processes, sectors, and ways of thinking can facilitate positive change. Welcome, Briana.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. We'll start out nice and easy. We would love to know your 5 simple pleasures.
5 simple pleasures. The first is taking a very hot, long bath after a long day and staying in there as long as possible, sometimes 2 hours, and my fingers turn pruny.
Topping it up with hot water every now and again.
Exactly. Yeah. Second simple pleasure is taking the time to cook a new recipe. I love kind of the texture of it. I love the taste, experimenting with new flavors, and the satisfaction of eating something that you've made yourself and nurturing people with it. Third is getting into a really good book, and a book that it's not about the pace of it and how quickly you read it, but you're just completely transported into a different place and being absorbed by that. The fourth is a good conversation with a dear friend, and that feeling of almost being transferred to this third space of kind of love and connection and deep understanding and the insights that come out of that. I heard someone talk about this recently of thinking to talk and talking to think. And I think I talk to think. So I need to do that verbal processing, and that's a really simple pleasure. And the fifth is feeling the change of season to fall and feeling the crisp, sharp, cold air kind of hitting your cheeks and the rest of your body, and knowing that this season, which is one of my favorites, has started.
I love it. I feel like I could be like printed out somewhere if I'm having a shit day. Just, Dani, tap into one of these 5 things and then you'll be okay. Because they are so me as well. And clearly a fellow American using the word fall.
Yes. Autumn, fall.
I am the same. I love this time of year. I know it hits a lot of people completely differently, but yeah, there's something about maybe the anticipation of the festive season, or coming together, or seeing friends and family more, or time off. Yes. But yeah, that change of weather as well. Yeah, it's good. Thanks for that. And the long hot baths. Yes. 2 hours might be more than I stay in there, but probably not far off that.
That's when I lose track of time. That was last night. I was my partner came in and said, you've been in here for 2 hours.
I love it. Yeah, I do often get, are you okay in there? Yes. Leave me alone. Brilliant. I would love to hear about your values and how, I guess, what are your top values that you live by?
It's such a good question for me, because so much of my life now and my work is about helping other people unearth and understand their values, and it's something I think about as a concept constantly, and I do this exercise every once in a while pretty regularly when I'm hosting a value session with other people, or kind of one-to-one, where I have to think about my own, and I always say that they shift and change to an extent based on where I am in my life, but I can very kind of firmly say that I have values around being a menace.
I love it.
And this is like my new word, because I think in the past that was kind of speaking truth to power, disruption, even though I don't know if speaking truth to power is a value exactly, but the being a menace in terms of being comfortable shaking things up and kind of channeling that menace energy. And I know that people have a lot of connotations around that word, but when I think about a menace, I used to be in a rock band. There's a lot of kind of that punk energy of like the 80s and 90s, and even in the past, that is like raw and green and silly and playful and menace, like of not being afraid to shake things up a bit. Play is really important as a value, and play also comes into this notion of being free and being silly and kind of looking at things with curiosity, which is a third as well, of trying to not take everything too seriously, because I do that a lot. And there's a part of me, whether or not it's my inner child or a younger version of me or a different part of me, that's constantly looking for kind of something that's playful and being led by curiosity, asking questions, trying to understand, seek clarity. And the fourth, did you say 5, or am I just giving you a list?
You can give me as many or as little as you want.
I think I'm stuck on 5 because we talked about 5 from the start. Creativity is another value, and integrity. And integrity can mean so many things to different people, and that can shift at different points in our life, but kind of staying true to not what we believe is right, because I don't think I see the world in this binary right and wrong. I think there's a lot of nuance when it comes to things, but I think there's kind of integrity around your beliefs and your values and how you try to live them in your day-to-day life. That doesn't always happen, and we're not always in situations where we can do that, but I think sticking to that as much as we can.
In all kind of environments,
yeah,
right? Not just around certain people or in certain spaces. And do you feel like those values, I think I know you well enough to like, they all make so much sense to me, but do you think those values have been with you from a very long time, or do you feel like they've evolved and they are what they are because of what you've been through to now?
That's such a great question. I think that to an extent they've always been there, because there are aspects of these values like play and being a menace that almost are likened to personas. It's like, okay, how is being a menace a value? How is being playful a value? And I think I've been so lucky to spend so much time with so many creative people over the last 10 years, service designers, dancers, all sorts of people that kind of really take their play seriously. And I know that people can look at a creative practice and think, oh, well, that is also a serious endeavor, bringing things into the world, making creations. But I have one long-term creative collaborator whose entire work is based around play and playfulness. And I think they've really shifted my perspective on what play can mean. I think sometimes we associate it with being childish or childlike or something that we outgrow or that's not appropriate anymore. And I know that's not everyone's perspective, but the person I was when I was very young was a person that grew up in an environment that was playful and open, and I was allowed to express myself and explore, and I was really trusted to do that. But also I was kind of sitting in this context of rules and keeping up appearances and politeness and ways that I had to be. And I think that actually there are parts of me that are constantly rebelling against the other parts. And so what's happened is some of these values were always there and really clear, but through my life experiences, it's like they've either become more apparent or they've shown up in different ways, or they've sort of evolved with me as being something I realized that I have to really focus on and center, because if I don't, I kind of lose parts of myself, or parts of myself feel constricted. So it definitely is something that's been there from the very beginning, but also they've evolved over time.
I love that. I mean, I often think about play, and usually at the end of the year or beginning of the year when I'm reflecting and thinking about what I want to bring more of in the kind of next phase or season, it's often play. But I think you're right. I maybe don't know. I'm not being expansive enough in my thinking about how I can bring play into my life. Can you give us an example of how you do that? Because I would love to hear it.
I would love to. And I say this with the caveat that I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I'm a kind of in recovery overachiever, and play is not always central to my life. Overscheduling, being over busy, over committing, being a bit of a people pleaser, totally fundamentals of how I move in the world. And so centering play, a really specific example I can give, which for those listening that are thinking about accounts and business and think about this space a lot, might resonate with them, and with others they might think, what a peculiar example. But I remember years ago, especially being self-employed and being a freelancer, I was getting to this point of the tax year would come up, self-assessment would come up, and I'd have no idea what was going on. And, you know, that kind of younger version of me, and also different people do this, not wanting to check your bank balance, not being, not having the right tools or the right space to kind of be financially responsible. Maybe that's kind of the term I'll use. I just got to a point where I was like, I cannot continue like this anymore. I have to be on top of things. And though I like money and I like spending it, I like numbers and I like organizing, I find kind of organization systems quite fun. I was the kid that my mom would go to the nail salon, and maybe this is also a neurodivergent spectrum thing. I would sit there for 20 minutes and color code all of the nail varnish by brand and color for like 20 minutes. And the nail salon kind of owners would just think I was cute because I was like 5. And at the end, I'd get a free kind of nail session. They'd paint my nails, and that was like our little exchange. Here comes Briana, who's gonna organize all the nail varnish, and we'll just give her a little thank you. So I love organizing, and I got to this point where I thought, okay, this is a task I can't stand, that brings me anxiety and stress and feelings of shame or whatever else. How can I make this more fun, and how can I bring play into this? So I created a kind of cash flow document or budget, whatever you want to call it. It's both. And I renamed all the categories. So for money that had to be paid out, I think it's something like landing. These are landing things that I need to pay, rather than thinking about it as a loss or something that is kind of leaving my account. Things that were coming in were abundance. I call the document something like B's like finance cycle, something a bit silly about like cycles and the moon. And so now every time I go into that document, it's color coded, it's got some fun headers, and I just think, oh yeah, I don't mind updating this, I don't mind looking at this, because actually like I'm not seeing this as something that is scary or dangerous or is kind of punitive. I'm seeing this as, oh yeah, I know what's happening with my finances, I can plan, it's fun and colorful, and this is enabling me to do things. I don't have to see this as something that I'm coming from this almost, and I don't love the term deficit mindset, but kind of this deficit space. It's a planning, need to do these things. These are things that are landing in my attention, and I then need to address them. But yeah, that's a very small example of how that's come into things.
And I think that's great articulation of the mindset of it. So you did little things, but actually it was your approach to it. It was the language you used around it. It was the kind of way you were thinking about the activity that you brought the playful element into. I love that. Okay, I'm going to take that on. I don't know. I think finance is a really good one, probably relative to many people. Talking about your kind of work, I would love to hear about the most random or maybe the worst job you've ever done.
Oh no. Random and worst. So if we went down the route of the worst job I've ever done, we'd be here for 2 hours.
Oh no.
But I'll say that I'll say that with this kind of around it. I'd say one of the most random jobs I've ever done, because I'm the type of person that will do anything, and I think over the years, and I don't know if this is a American mindset thing or it depends on really the person. It's sort of like you might be working your way up to something. I'm always that person. If I'm volunteering or involved in something, I'll scrub something, I'll take bins out, whatever's needed I'll do. So the kind of randomness of things is, I think, part of my working life. But if I think about one of the worst jobs I've ever done, it was when it was a summer, I was working on an urban farm in Milwaukee, and I'll say no more in case anyone else hears this from Milwaukee. And I was very happy to work on this urban farm. They were pioneering aquaponics technology, which is, for those of you that don't know, it's this closed loop system where you have fish in a fish tank. You kind of channel the wastewater from the tank up to a kind of platform of plants, which fertilizes the plants, and the plants distill and clear the water, and it goes back into the fish tank. It's a closed loop system, and my background's in sustainable development, I should say, so that's part of this interest. And it wasn't really the job itself. I love the animals, I love being on site. It was really kind of serious labor, and there wasn't a lot of training that went into it from the start, which I fed back later. But part of what the worst side of it was that I think the organization itself was brilliant and was winning all of these awards and doing this great work, but kind of what was happening behind the scenes was a real mess. And I think it was really beautifully kind of exemplified by the situation that I'd have every morning, which was when I was looking after these goats. I think they were like Alsace-Lorraine goats. They were very specific goats they'd got for this urban farm and this tiny bit of land. You'd walk in to feed the goats. The goats were being fed with donated hay that actually was molding. So even though the hay was donated and was being reused in the social enterprise, it was making the goats sick. So you'd go in and have to give them some algae to kind of get their nutrient levels up. And I would go to the kind of goat pen every morning, and this one goat would stick its head through the fence. It was kind of like a wired fence and made a hole and couldn't get itself back out. So literally every single morning we were trying to get this goat's head through this tiny hole. And coming back to why this was bad, and I had a great experience in general, it comes back to kind of my wider work. My question was, why haven't we fixed this problem? Why do we not have a system in place where this doesn't happen? And also, systemically, why are we feeding them hay that's making them sick, even if it's a cost saving, even if it's kind of recycling materials? To me, the whole structure just didn't make any sense, and it was perfectly exemplified by this really silly situation of this goat that was actually being a menace and was like, I'm fed up with this. I don't like this. I'm sticking my head through the hole, and you people are just going to have to deal with this every single morning because you're being silly. And I think actually that speaks to kind of the question about values earlier in my wider work. It's like, I think when I see something that feels like it's out of alignment or doesn't work or doesn't make sense, and I speak to it, and maybe other people in that environment and that system have just accepted it. It's the status quo. It's the way things are done. I end up being really disruptive in these spaces by asking what I think is simple questions, being led by curiosity, not really passing judgment, even though maybe in this situation I was judging it, and kind of going, what is happening here and why? And I think actually that's really a theme that's been pulled out throughout the rest of my work. But I mean, I had to do all sorts of random jobs. Last thing I'll say about this, they let me drive a box truck, which for anyone who doesn't know what a box truck looks like, it's not a huge van, but you know, you don't have much visibility in the back on the highway to deliver some hay to some random place I'd never been before, back in the days where you had to use MapQuest and there was no sat nav. And I'm shocked I made it there and back in one piece. So all of it has been an adventure.
I love it. And how old were you at this job?
I was 20, maybe 19 or 20.
Yeah. But it sounds like even then you recognized what needed to change and questioned why people would just carry on doing something that wasn't working, which is now actually what you're focusing on a bit in your current work.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I think the other element of this too is that without me knowing why, and some people say they just have a face and that, you know, allows people to tell them the deepest, darkest secrets. If I've been in a taxi with a taxi driver, or I've just smiled and met someone on the pavement and having a chat with them, they will start telling me things. I was in a situation in that environment where staff and other people were coming to me and going, this has been going on, this has been happening. And I was in quite a tricky situation because I was sent to that farm by the funder that was funding them. And I was sent probably to do a little bit of reconnaissance, but mostly because it was part of my internship. I was working with the funder for the first month. They knew I had an interest in urban farming and sustainable development, so they sent me off to Milwaukee for the second. And I think little to my knowledge, or maybe conscious knowledge, it was like, oh, I'm playing this role in this situation. I didn't really ask for. I'm just being myself. I'm just being observant. I'm asking questions. I'm being open maybe. But now I have all of this knowledge that I didn't really anticipate having or gathering. And I can put it in the context of the wider, bigger picture. And I think not everyone thinks in that way or feels the kind of need or feels compelled to make those connections. Other people might get that information and go, okay, none of my business, not my circus, not my monkeys, not my problem. And I think I can't help but see connections and wider picture and strategy. And yes, I think that's why a big portion of my work is now, and always kind of has been when I've been in senior leadership roles in arts organizations or setting up events or festivals or working with people, it's kind of strategy and how do things connect, what needs to change. I started off in student politics and the student movement. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in a political environment. I think some of that is like nurture of I'm always around people thinking about a next election campaign and a next election cycle and policies and how they look and how they're communicating and how they're gathering information. So I think there's like an information gathering sponge part of me. But also I was speaking to a coach a few months ago who was diagnosed autistic, kind of, or self-diagnosed, and she was saying, people on the autistic spectrum might see that kind of wider picture and can't ignore it as much because of how they maybe make connections in the world. So yes, it's definitely influenced the work I do now.
Yeah, I'll ask you about the next question. It's about risk, but I'm just thinking in terms of risk, how being a disruptor or a menace, as you call them, how sometimes that is risky. And I wondered if you've come in contact with that or experienced that you can't stop because that's part of who you are and what you see and what you believe in, but also, has it gotten you in trouble?
Of course.
Thought that might be the answer.
And risk is such a big one because some of my other work, and I always find it so fun and complex and complicated to communicate what it is I do and am interested in, and I'm so grateful that I've had the opportunity to work across so many different sectors. But I've done a lot of work in kind of the women's sector when it comes to violence against women and girls through a charity I've been involved with for nearly 8 years. It was my second job out of uni, and then I later on stayed involved on their steering group and their board, or work I've been doing with vulnerable communities in the arts, whether or not it's workshops with young people or vulnerable adults. There is this whole question of, when it comes to risk and when we're thinking about our own trauma and our own lived experience, what is a risk we actually can take on, or what can we handle? And handle's maybe not the word I want to look for, or hold, because I've started kind of in the last 2 years doing anti-racism workshops and sessions, and to some extent, though I didn't always call it anti-racism and hadn't really understood the full kind of spectrum of that approach, I've always done equality, diversity, and inclusion work. I was part of the diversity club in my middle school. When I look at my mother, who was, a black woman in an all-white kind of firm of men who were very conservative, and she had a different political leaning to them, that's always been kind of part of my kind of worldview and approach. And coming back to that question of risk, I think what happens sometimes, and I say this when I'm doing the anti-racism training, you might see something that's not right, or you might want to pick someone up on something, but there has to be this kind of internal risk assessment of your own safety. Is this the right time and place? Do I know this person well enough? Is there a physical, emotional, psychological risk to me kind of speaking out? When we think about timing and kind of the time-space continuum of, okay, I need time to process, I need time to seek advice, I need time to work out what the right approach is. And quite often, I think what happens when we disrupt, or we're a menace, or we whistleblow, or whatever else, there needs to sort of be an assessment of the situation. It's like, is this a crisis situation? How might people respond? Will there be a knee-jerk reaction? Will there be defensiveness? Will there be shame? What is kind of happening on people's physiological and kind of emotional landscape? And thankfully, over time, I've had more time to reflect on that and learn about it. I think I haven't always spoken out. I haven't always stepped into situations because it's not always my place, or it doesn't feel safe to. But quite often what happens is I tend to stay in situations that maybe are harmful or toxic, and we'll come back to that in a moment, for too long, whether or not it's a toxic work environment, or I'm being micromanaged, or someone else is being mistreated. And I think what ultimately happens with me is I can't stay quiet after a long period of time. It ends up coming out. But yeah, it's not always possible for people, or they're not always kind of equipped with the tools they need to kind of navigate that. And then we can't anticipate who's going to react, how they'll respond. And then the really practical risks of, is it your workplace? Is it a family member? Is it a partner? What is actually safe for you in that moment? And that's why I think when we were talking about integrity at the start, it's like, you can have values around integrity and act in your integrity, but sometimes your circumstances, it's not safe for you to do that. So I think actually that's a really fundamental and really important part of kind of the risk of assessing, is it worth it? But then, I also think about the world in terms of energy. And sometimes I think kind of when there's abuse of power or something's kind of off, the energy around that kind of, it builds. It's kind of like a bit of a volcano or a snowball or something. Well, snowball doesn't erupt, but something that might erupt. So I think actually those things never stay under the surface. They seep out in ways eventually, or they're impacting people or the environment around them. I mean, we can think about this in terms of the climate crisis and how we're treating the planet. We can think about this in terms of different environments. So yeah, I think that eventually the toxicity will out. It will come out. But yeah, my role in that has been sometimes an unsuspecting facilitator of surfacing things that I don't always intend to, because once again I look at it and think, oh yeah, that seems a bit off, or let me ask this question. It's like boom. And I think I've spent a lot of time in the last kind of 2 years, especially in the process of the book I've been writing, trying to explore what is actually happening in these situations. What are the tools I can use to kind of make that risk assessment? Is the risk worth it? And yeah, have I kind of gotten in trouble? I think, you know, there's so many situations where, and so many aspects of, you know, living in Scotland and being in such a kind of small country and such a great creative community, where that's nurturing and life-giving and collaborative and wonderful. But, you know, I think as well, we can here sometimes have a bit of a small town and village mentality, and I see why that happens. So, you know, if someone's challenging the status quo or the way things are, there's a kind of attitude or a kind of reaction of like, well, we're going to close rank, or we're going to turn our backs, or we're not going to get involved, or that seems a bit messy, or I don't know what's happening. And it comes back to, you know, our wider kind of social narrative around call out culture and I don't really like using this term, but cancel culture. It's like, what do you do when actually it's someone you know and love, or someone that you're close to, someone that's not distant from you and you have a relationship to, and how do you kind of manage that and repair and explore that? And this book that came out earlier this year, The List by Yomi Adebagoki, she kind of published this book called The List, which was very much about an activist and feminist writer whose partner is named on a list of abusers that goes live 2 weeks before their wedding. And this book is kind of a novel about how she navigates that and what happens to their relationship. And I think there's so much about, what do we do in these situations?
Honestly, that's the most thoughtful kind of mature response to that. I kind of thank you. No, I think you're right, and it's complex, isn't it? And there's no one answer, and there's no one way, and there's no one approach. It's about taking into consideration a lot of factors. And I think you're smart. Clearly, that's a learned experience response, I think, about what you can handle, what you're prepared to do. You know, your head might be thinking something, but your body might be thinking another thing, and your experiences might be thinking a separate thing in addition to all of those other thoughts. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That's a nice thing for a lot of people to ponder, I think, for a while. Yeah. Kind of on the theme of risk, but I want to get into your kind of working journey. I love, you know, you've done lots of things. I'm sure there's a thread that kind of goes through them, but what's the biggest risk you've taken in work to date, or that you plan to take? I don't know how you want to talk about that, but I'd love to hear about kind of what your journey's been like.
Beautiful question. And I'd say the biggest risk that I've taken in my work is the very first thing that I did, which was setting up an arts festival. But it was much wider than that. I think the biggest risk was starting my career, for lack of a better phrase and a way to approach it, because I came from a kind of background and a family environment, and also a wider social environment where going to uni, having a job that was a 9-to-5, and that was quite structured, was an expectation. And I know that everyone's journey into the world of work is very different. You know, people might not go to college or uni, people might have a trade, be an apprentice. And the funny thing is, I say this having two parents that were freelance and self-employed and grandparents that my grandmother was an English teacher, my grandpa was a civil servant, but they had very rich creative lives. My mom trained as a ballet dancer and was one of the attendees of one of the first historically Black ballet schools in the US. She continues to dance now, and she teaches now, but that was after like a 40-year break from dance. My grandpa is a voice actor, does community theatre. My uncle's a drummer. So there's a lot of people that are very creative in my family, but the whole kind of approach to this was, that's a hobby, that's not a career, that's not a life, that's not something you do full time. And I don't think it was ever explicitly stated to me until I was thinking about what I was going to do after school. And I think that when I started my kind of working life, I was at Edinburgh University. I was elected president of my students association, and that wasn't a fluke or a mistake. You know, I spent 2 years campaigning for this. I was really involved in student politics, from international student issues. I worked with a lot of people in the student union, and you know, it's typical that I was in a leadership role that was political, given kind of where I grew up, but also it's something I love. And I remember being at this point where I was elected president of my students association, and being from the States, student unions don't have the same power, structure, funding, importance, and stature as they do in the UK. And I think a lot of family, not so much friends, were sort of like, well, what are you going to do from there? And in my head, I was like, this is a massive opportunity. We'll open loads of doors. I'll be in touch with lots of different people. But they were sort of just like, what is your plan? Like, what do you mean you're going to do this for a year and then what? I don't think they even realized it was a paid job for a year.
Right.
And in that year, I set up this arts festival, and some of that came from my own feeling of being repressed as an artist, my own beliefs and kind of experiences around not having gone to art school, of not pursuing my own creative career. I was in a rock band, I painted. I still am a very creative person, but I think I was feeling quite stifled. And also back to this whole thing of kind of information gathering and working out what's needed. A lot of people felt like a space for emerging artists and creative people outside the festival season, outside of August and June and July, that was led by emerging artists and creatives. I don't want to say young people, because you can be any age to be an emerging artist or creative, was really part of that journey. And the big risk that I took was basically leaving my role, finishing up my role at the Students Association, setting up this festival, which my visa was dependent on. I was on this graduate entrepreneurial visa. It was like being in Dragon's Den, having to pitch for my life and convince, you know, local business people that this was a good enough idea and unique enough for me to stay in the UK to pursue. And it didn't generate any income. So I had to sort out what I was going to do with myself the rest of the time. And I worked part-time at the National Theatre of Scotland and loads of places. But the big risk was, I remember being in my flat with my partner at the time, running this festival. Absolutely, I was staying in a flat that he owned, so I didn't really have to pay rent. And being in this position of like, well, what on earth am I going to do to make money? And, you know, I did events. I obviously could manage people and organize programs and support artists, but I remember going to a local arts organization that I was a part of at the time called Creative Edinburgh, and I knew that Janine, who was running it at the time, had a colleague who had just left, and she was setting up their maybe 4th annual Creative Edinburgh Awards. And again, my partner at the time was super supportive, was just like, well, if you don't ask, you don't get, so why don't you email her and ask her if she needs any help? And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, just do it. And so I remember sending that first email and trying to work out what my day rate was going to be and asking her if she needed help. She's like, actually, I really do. And yes, please take on this work. And then kind of we had to negotiate what the rate would be and everything else, but it was brilliant. And that started my kind of freelance and self-employed career. And I always remember that moment of kind of having to put myself out there, of kind of having to pitch myself, which I'd been doing for the festival and been doing to funders, but kind of having to position yourself as someone that's doing work and kind of what that looks like, and thinking about your approach and actually how you deliver on that. It's still a kind of through line in the rest of my working life of, you know, being this chameleon of a person. And a lot of people are that have a lot of skills and interests. How do you package yourself? You know, I've spent so much of my career supporting artists to think about income generation, or organizations to think about income generation and sustainability, and how they're going to kind of make that work without compromising their needs and their values, or thinking about different income streams. As we both know, when it comes to social enterprise, that whole model of, you know, you're generating income to reinvest, if you think of it that way in the other activity, how does that all gel and what does that look like? And I think that has always been part of the kind of journey of, as I've seen it, as being an apprentice of the arts. You know, I left focus, which was very much on kind of the climate crisis and the environment. And I spent years thinking about how horrible things were, and not how hopeless they were by any means, but sort of thinking, what is my role going to be in this process? I'm not a conservationist. I don't work with animals. I'm not working with coral reefs and ecosystems. I'm not going to get involved in the politics of policy and kind of changing things. Activist spaces didn't feel right. Thinking about carbon didn't feel right. I was interested in kind of the social, economic, political impacts, but I was exhausted. And I think a lot of ways we do environmental education and sustainable development education doesn't kind of take into account people's emotional life and how stressful that can be. So part of the risk was, okay, I've always been creative. I love the arts. I want to be around people that think differently, that bring things into being, that world build, that can imagine a different future that isn't so grim. And how can I spend this first part of my career just learning from different aspects of the arts and creative industries? And that was a real risk, because literally everyone I knew was like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And how are you going to do it? And why?
That's a really high level perspective of your working life career journey. When did you start thinking that way?
I think I always thought that way, but from not consciously. I think there was sort of this intuition, this gut instinct that I wanted to go into the arts and creative sector, that was always part of me. And I've always thought about sustainable development also as accountability, governance, structures, power, who makes decisions. So when I've worked in the arts and cultural sector, I've always worked in it from that kind of high level. What is the structure? How is this going to work? How are we going to facilitate things for other people? But, it's been a journey, because I've had moments in my journey where I've had this, and I've talked about this with other people in the environmental sector and kind of climate crisis sector. It's like that activist guilt of like, am I doing enough? And am I doing the right thing? And I think I've had to maybe reverse engineer sometimes my thinking, because it's sort of like, well, I'm not doing anything directly involved in the climate crisis, but actually where am I bringing sustainability and sustainable development and ethical approaches and thinking about new structures of power and hierarchies into my work? And I've always been quite a nerd when it comes to politics and power, but yeah, I think part of that process was not justifying my journey, but trying to understand what was motivating me to do this. And actually, it was only a couple of years in where I was like, oh yeah, I've gone from sustainable development into the cultural sector and creative industries from a social enterprise perspective, because that seems like the next stage. How do we build differently? How do we restructure? How do we create? And how do we also embrace the cycle of creation, death, and transformation and kind of rebirth? And that maybe gets into the witchy and spiritual side of things, but if we look at it from a design process, it's like, well, how do you prototype and fail? Where is failure allowed? Where can we be kind of more generous and compassionate with that? And it's been designers and creatives that have really enabled that and unlocked that thinking in ways that maybe in the government and public service and the third sector even, that's not allowed, or it's frowned upon.
I'm just thinking that, please, could we just do a trial where we put different people into power and they think that way, and when the planning comes to please. Yeah, that's amazing. So what are you working on right now?
Oh goodness. So I will keep this concise. I am working on a book called Make Good Trouble, A Guide to the Energetics of Disruption, that actually is leading into what my work will sit under for the foreseeable future. So I've set up something called the Good Trouble Co. And this will hold all of the work I do now, which is coaching, strategy work, values-based work, anti-racism work, governance work. I'm working with a lot of organizations that are thinking about radical governance structures. How do you set up an organization without a traditional board? Who has power? Who makes decisions? When it comes to anti-racism, how do we embed all of these practices and principles and approaches into our work? But what's been really interesting that's been coming out of that is that it's all kind of grounded in this element of disruption. And I think I got to a point in my career in 2021 where I thought to myself, I keep working for organizations or being asked to kind of get involved in projects where my values don't align or something will happen. Let's say it's financial management, let's say whatever it is that's happening. And I keep kind of stepping away from these situations, which to me sort of feel like, it's out of integrity. I'm stepping away. it was a work contract. It's not a big deal. I'm kind of ending an employment relationship. But, you know, when you're working with a founder, and we can talk about founders and startups and social enterprises for days, you're working with a founder or someone that's kind of brought an idea into existence. That's their baby, and you're kind of helping them build this vision. Where I thought to myself, why am I spending all of my time helping other people and facilitating other people to build their vision for the world? And I keep kind of getting into these, well, not getting into it, I'm actively participating, but I'm in these situations where I'm constantly being disruptive when I really, it's not even that I don't mean to be, it's just that it's like there's always this kind of thing coming up. There's something that's happening. And I really sat and reflected on this for a month. I was like, so what's going on here? Why does this keep happening? And I think I really started to understand it kind of in energetic terms. And I've had a lot of kind of work and training I've done with energy healers and shaman and astrologers and tarot readers, which we could talk about if you'd like. But on the other side of things, I had this moment of kind of, again, shifting perspective. It's like, no, I can be disruptive. That's fine. If I'm going to be disruptive in a space, and this happens so often for people coming into organizations to run them, they'll say, we want someone that's going to change things, that has new ideas, that's disruptive. But ultimately, they don't want that change. So they react to it. It's too hard. And it's like, okay, if I'm going to be disruptive, I'm going to be paid for it. And that's going to be the understanding and the premise kind of on which I work with people, so that they know that they're coming in to pay me to be disruptive. I'll be a consultant, I'll give my recommendations, and I'll go bye-bye. And I'm not kind of vested in that process of change, and I can be this kind of external eye, and it won't be so energetically draining and exhausting. And so Make Good Trouble has been a kind of exploration of the energy of disruption from like my own personal experiences, from my investigations of energy, from other people's experiences. And it's also about how do we manage these things that feel inexplicable and kind of we can't process simply through words and our own actions. And it obviously impacts our bodies, it impacts our psyches and our worldviews and everything else. And I also have a creative practice, which I always giggle about. There's a little part of me that's like, yes, I'm an artist, I guess. I have a creative practice, and so part of kind of Make Good Trouble is making space for all of this disruptive work, and also having time to be playful and creative.
I'm always open to kind of big ways of thinking, new ways of thinking. I know enough to know that my little brain doesn't know very much at all. So I need to keep learning and keep open, right?
Yeah.
Would love to hear a time where you felt in a state of flow or you experienced a sense of awe.
Should it be work related, or can it be anything?
It can be anything.
Despite some of the things I've said, and maybe because of all the things I've said, I love working. I love my work. I love the people I meet through that work. I love seeing artists bring their vision to life. I love being challenged and experiencing beauty and really seeing people's perspectives on the world and really being kind of inspired. And I'm really grateful that all of the work I've done has really contributed to that. And working in the creative industries and with creative people has been so beautiful for that, for so many reasons. And I really have so much reverence for artists and creative people that commit their lives to making their work and making the time for it and carving out the space for it and taking it seriously and practicing. And there's something so beautiful about that. So with that in mind, the process of writing Make Good Trouble has been a journey. It's been wild. I'm so grateful I have a publisher. I'm so grateful I was offered a book deal. I know that's not everyone's journey to writing. I contributed a chapter to an anthology on witchcraft and healing 2 years ago that led to this book, Make Good Trouble. The publisher read my chapter and said, hey, we loved it. You want to write a book? And I was like, this is not for real. You're kidding, right? Amazing. I said, no, let's do it. And I think for me, this process of awe and flow has been through talking about the book. So I've been working with someone that's helping me create content for the book, and we're doing a podcast in the future, and we're also kind of recording content, but sitting there, living in Porty on the beach and talking about a crystal or talking about a tarot card and kind of tying that to the wider themes of what's happening in the world or happening that week astrologically has kind of created a real space for all of my the values I brought up earlier, kind of curiosity, play, being a menace, integrity, that has really allowed me to experience states of flow in a way that, not that I haven't in a long time, but in a way that's more consistent. So I can go to that and go, yeah, this is a really expansive space. And also, back to your earlier question about, are people open to this? It's like, I think the more that we do what we love and we focus time and attention on that, it attracts and brings other people to us that are interested in those things as well, or maybe we're more focused on that. And I've been so supported by the kind of healing, tarot, witchy, astrological community in Edinburgh and in Scotland since 2017, when I kind of refocused on this due to personal things going on. But yeah, those are some real moments of awe and flow. And I also we've just adopted a kitten and she's a menace. And taking moments to kind of in my day to kind of see the world through her eyes. You know, she'll sit on the table and just look out to the sea and just stare out at the sea for 20 minutes, and really being kind of forced to slow down a little bit, because I'm looking after a living being who is really clumsy and doesn't know what's going on. So that's kind of where I think the awe has come into, of having time for more space and slowness.
Nice. I love that. I love that so much. Oh, thank you so much. I feel like I could carry on talking, and actually maybe we should do a part 2, because we haven't got to the other stuff that I would love to chat about. But thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dani, and thank you, Alice.
To hear more about Tribe Porty and Keystone, you can find us on all social media platforms. Please head over to our website and subscribe to our newsletters, which includes monthly blogs to provide helpful insights into how we craft our work and life. This has been Working for Progress. We hope you join us again.